that way. This is because this is an opportunity for me to talk about a number of different things that come together in a book that I have that's coming out, I hope, this summer. It's only one part of it, but it's a really, I think, really interesting part of it. And the book is called Learning from Our Mistakes, Epistemology for the Real World. And in that book, I know, for example, Paul was at a lecture I gave in January. I'm going to start off with the same warnings that I did with that one, but then I'm going to take off in a somewhat different direction. And at the end, I'll maybe come back and just say a few things about the book. But for today, I want to actually talk about topics that all of us here are philosophy teachers. And we all have, I believe most of us anyway, have somewhat similar training. And I want to talk about how that training actually has given us certain kinds of presuppositions in epistemology that I think are deeply mistaken and that have actually led to a really kind of very interesting phenomenon, very interesting contrast. I actually work in every area that having to do with normativity, but my main areas are moral and political philosophy and epistemology. And here, what I do in the book is I'm going to use the history of epistemology to look for clues. But there's one big clue that I want to start out with, the clue of why did epistemology go wrong? How did it go wrong? And the big clue is when I'm working in moral and political philosophy in the Western tradition, I feel as though, well, there are lots of missteps in any tradition, but overall, it's a really positive tradition. It's really contributed to all sorts of important ideas and views that really make a difference, and you can go and you can be proud of John Locke's social contract theory, and also even Rousseau, it has really a beautiful theory, and you can see, wow, of course, the French Revolution ended up as a disaster, but still to have had the ideas fundamental to the French Revolution, just as I think Locke had many of the ideas fundamental to the American Revolution. Wow, that's philosophy actually making a difference in the world, and it's a difference for good. And so when I look in political philosophy, if you ask me, what was the most important idea in philosophy, completely in philosophy in the 20th century, I think it was what I call the Harsanyi-Rawls original position. Rawls developed it later, but Harsanyi was the first one to develop it. And it's a fascinating thought experiment. It shows exactly to me the power of philosophy. One thought experiment that can be taken. Now, of course, both of them were using it to try to come up with sort of the fundamental principles of justice. Well, good luck with that. I don't think it's really that useful for that, but it's great for just analyzing all sorts of different kinds of real world situations. Like, even from the original position, could you justify slavery in the original position? Well, now here's the thing, and there's no thought experiment or anything else that'll turn people into moral people. And so if you were, a committed slave owner, I'm sure, if I'd gone back, before the Civil War and said, well, let's go behind the veil of ignorance. Would you endorse slavery? I'm sure they would have. In other words, I'm not claiming that it solves all problems, but I'm thinking that it's a really powerful way of thinking. And then if it's approached in the right way, it's really powerful. Okay, then I say, now let's go and take a look at the history of Western epistemology. And you go out and you say, man, think of all the contributions that have been made in moral and political philosophy. I mean, I only mentioned a few, there's so many. And then you say, okay, how about Western epistemology? Where are the contributions that Western epistemology, and now I know that you're all philosophy teachers and you're going to say, well, there are lots of ways in which philosophical thinking and so on, but I'm just still saying, I'm going to do on really simple-minded things like, Okay, well, how about climate change? Has Western epistemology helped us to understand the conflict between those who believe in climate change and the climate change denialists? And you immediately think, oh, and I'm going to talk more about David Hume today. Well, David Hume said basically we can have no rational beliefs about the future at all. None. And so David Hume provides as much support to the climate change denialist as to the advocate of climate change. And that's an easy one. I mean, that's a no-brainer. Okay, I'm going to say some more about other things later. But to me, what that indicates is for all, I mean, these are really smart guys, and I'm going to now start sharing my screen. And they're very, I mean, they're very, and yet somehow or other, all these smart guys have somehow gotten engaged in an enterprise which has taken us nowhere except to further and further like depths of skepticism or the other things what I'll talk about shortly. Why is that? Why, when I look out at moral and political philosophy, do I see a flowering garden? And why, when I look out at epistemology, now I'm looking at it not as well, it's really intricate, but just in terms of, think of all these real world issues. I mean, now with, with alt facts and so on, you see, that's why I include Western epistemology. I'm just not going to talk about American. I mean, think of all the different varieties of, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstructionism, and so many of them deny there's even any truth. No truth. So in other words, forget, we're not, you can know this philosophy is not going to help you with climate change. There's not even any truth. Okay. So now, anyway, I said I was going to share my screen, but I can't talk and share my screen at the same time. So give me just a second here to. Okay, so here, this is where we are on February 19th, 2021. And where did Western epistemology go wrong and why? Why, when we look out, do we see a wasteland? And I'm saying, I'm agreeing with you. There's all sorts of beauty in it that you can appreciate philosophically. But when you ask, is it relevant to the real world? The answer is, well, if it is relevant, the real world's in big trouble. Okay, trigger warning, the history of Western epistemology can be shocking. And because you've been internalized to philosophy and epistemology, you may have become inured to how shocking it is. So part of what I want to do today is to just, it's really like, I hate to, I don't want to, I don't want to actually reawaken old traumas, but in this case, actually, it's actually worthwhile a little bit. Okay. And then I'm going to say that the history, what we're going to see is it's a history in part of interconnected intellectual pathologies. And that's the part I'm primarily going to focus on. And boy, you'll see the main part. And what I want to do is they're not the product of bad people, but they're product of something. And that's what we're looking for clues to. What is it that's the problem that has led Western epistemology into what I'm going to claim are dead ends? Okay, and so in order to answer that question, I want to go back to the epistemological Garden of Eden, which you may have heard me do before. This is where I break off into this talk after this one. In the epistemological Garden of Eden, no one realizes they have ever made a mistake. So why would they need epistemology? So epistemology begins with the discovery, for each one of them, I made a mistake. And sadly, in Western epistemology, and it may be true generally, but in Western, this discovery generated an intense emotional reaction. Two emotions: first, shame at having made a mistake, and then anxiety that I might make a mistake again. And so error was epistemic original sin. And at the beginning, Western epistemology was defined by the anxious question, how can I guarantee that I avoid making a mistake? And this is familiar to you. You know this. I mean, that's what Descartes starts with. But I want to go back to the beginning where that anxious question actually leads to a pathway, that pathway which then sort of, in a way, determines the history of Western epistemology. And the pathway starts in ancient Greece with the discovery of what I call the proof paradigm for knowledge and rational belief. And it begins with the discovery of mathematical proofs in ancient Greece. And then we have Parmenides' use of deductive proof in philosophy to prove that reality is one and unchanging. And so that's the first example that I know of. Some of you may even know an earlier one, but where it's like he contrasts the method of the senses which lead to error, which the method of reason which leads to truth, and then he gives this proof. And of course, the doors over Plato's Academy said, let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. And we know in the Meno, Socrates elicits from a slave boy the proof of a special case of the Pythagorean theorem to illustrate his epistemology of the forms. So what we can see is that we've got a whole epistemology, and obviously the epistemology is aimed at making sure we never make a mistake. And there was one thing missing from the epistemology, which was a theory of reasoning. And so Aristotle, with his great discovery of syllogistic reasoning, also sent epistemology down this pathway of the proof paradigm, because now we had an account of deductively valid inference. And even 2,000 years later, when Kant was writing, he was able to argue that for all practical purposes, Aristotle had completed logic. We now know that there was a lot more to come, and that was Frege, but still, that's how influential Aristotle's syllogistic logic was. And by the way, syllogism now we use to refer to certain kinds of reasoning in Aristotle, but for Aristotle, it actually just meant deductively valid. That's what his goal was, to identify deductively valid rules of reasoning. And then what I'm now calling the proof paradigm is now launched on its way, and there are 5 presuppositions. And historically, you can find philosophers who have all 5 of the presuppositions. At the beginning, you find all 5 of them. But even as people start to break away, they still end up with holding on to maybe 1 or 2, and every one of them is a problem. What are they? Infallibilism, all rational belief is infallible. Deductivism, the laws of logic are laws of rational reasoning. I mean, that seems obvious to philosophers. Inferentialism, all laws of rational reasoning are inferential in the sense that they are unidirectional and monotonic. Okay, here, well, unidirectional means that the reasoning goes in one direction from the premises to the conclusion, and monotonic means that it always adds new beliefs. It never subtracts them. And we can see the influence of the deductivist assumption on reasoning, because when other kinds of reasoning are identified by philosophers, they're called like induction. Well, induction, of course, the word itself is based on the word deduction or abduction or inference to the best explanation. Inference, the idea of inference. And all of you, I'm sure, can recall back to probably your earliest epistemology class, where that you get the problem of the regress. Well, if some beliefs are inferentially justified, then there have to be some that aren't, or what are the alternatives, you know? Well, inferentialism, the assumption that reasoning is inferential. First premises, well, if reasoning is inferential, you have to have some first premises that don't depend on other beliefs for their support, and they're the non-inferentially justified ones. And then finally, first-person access. We have first-person access to what makes our beliefs rational when they are. And what's crucial to understand is that even though very few philosophers accept all 5 of them, even one of these presuppositions can have a large distorting effect on epistemology. And sadly, even philosophers who reject all 5 of them often manifest distorting effects that have just infected their thinking by intellectual osmosis from the proof paradigm. Okay, and so now we have the 3 poles of Western epistemology. I'm just going to say what they are, and then we'll, starting right from the beginning, you get Platonism, skepticism, relativism, the 3 alternatives. The rest of the history of Western epistemology is going to be oscillating among these 3 alternatives, at least Western epistemology that isn't theological. Okay, so let's do Platonism. Well, Plato, for Platonism, you have to have direct access to necessary truth. And for Plato, that was through the intellectual apprehension of the forms, which we remembered from an earlier life. And so it provides the first premises for purely rational knowledge. And that's the way that we get, sort of the positive picture of the proof paradigm. That's the way we get knowledge or rational belief. And of course, we use Aristotle's syllogistic reasoning once we've got the first premises. Well, the next alternative is skepticism. And the most famous representative of that is Socrates, of whom the Delphic oracle said that there was, quote, none wiser in Athens. And you think, you teach your students, wow, well, if the oracle said there's none wiser, he must have known a lot, right? But no, as a matter of fact, Socrates summed up his wisdom by saying that while his fellow Athenians mistakenly think that they know many things, I neither know nor think that I know. Now, of course, I want to translate this over into rational belief, but so do you have no rational beliefs at all, Socrates? Well, that's the skeptical alternative. And then we have the relativist alternative. And of course, who represents that? But Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. This is a relativist doctrine that there is no non-relative truth, but only truth for someone. And then I want to extend that in epistemology. The other important kind of relativism is relativism about rationality. So rational for you, rational for me. And where do we find that? I mean, in probably the largest movement in American philosophy, pragmatism. What's rational for me depends on what my goals are. So truth or rationality can be held relative to be relative to a culture, a language game, evolution, etc. There are lots of different forms of relativism. Okay, and then what about the nature of epistemic rationality? And I'm going to do the 3 options for that, and the 3 non-theological options, because probably you're familiar with the work of Alvin Plantinga. There are the theists who say, oh, look, we have another alternative. Basically, God made us so that we have, reliable beliefs or whatever. But the 3 non-theological options are Platonism. The fundamental principles of epistemic rationality are true in all possible worlds. We have direct epistemic access to them. And of course, the history of Western epistemology has been, what do you do when finally it becomes so clear, it took a long time, that we don't have direct epistemic access to those principles? Well, what do? You have 2 alternatives: skepticism, and by skepticism, I include non-cognitivism, anything that says, well, there are no truths of, epistemic rationality, or we don't have any rational beliefs about what they are. And then relativism. Epistemic rationality is relative to one's culture, language game, facts about evolution, etc. And this includes naturalist cognitivism, where what's rational for human beings is relative to our evolutionary background, what was favored by evolution. If I had more time, I would try to persuade you that all 3 of these options are dead ends. But at least I have to tell you they are, so you can start to see as we go through, we talk about others, you can see, oh yeah, this is why they keep coming up to these often literally insane conclusions. I believe it is due to the influence of the 5 presuppositions of proof paradigm. That's all the alternative. These 3 seem to exhaust all the non-theological alternatives. That people come back ever again to one of these 3 alternatives, when each one of them is a dead end. And so that means that if you're doing epistemology, almost no matter which one you pick, you can always at least make a strong criticism of the other 2. Your own may have its problems, but you can always make a strong criticism of the other 2. And when you look at the history of Western epistemology, what you find are certain kinds of intellectual pathologies. And these intellectual pathologies I trace back to the proof paradigm. Obviously, I don't have time to do the tracing here, but I want to draw your attention to these pathologies because this is where you get to, in philosophy, kind of repressed memory. That philosophers at some level have an awareness, well, there are these problems. There are these problems with these different views, but they've sort of, repress the memory. And what I'm doing today, part of it is a kind of group therapy where we allow the memories to come back, because if we're going to make our peace with them, we have to just allow them the freedom to get expressed. Self-refuting views. We find in the Western epistemology lots of self-refuting views. Here's an example of a self-refuting view. Everything that I say is false. I mean, look, if it's true, it's false. So why would anybody say that? And yet people say things that are hardly more, almost as transparent as that one. Self-undermining views. It can never be rational to believe a universal generalization. Well, number 2 itself is a universal generalization, right? And so if it's true, it can't be rational to believe it. So it's different from self-refuting. There's no contradiction in there. It's just it can't be rational to believe it. It could actually be true. And then explanation empiric framework substitutions. And my example here is phenomenalism, because it's been so influential in philosophy. And I'm going to say some more about it, what I mean by explanation impairing. Okay, so now Hume is going to be, for me, a test case. Just we're going to look at Hume because, we'll see. Hume is the most influential epistemologist, certainly in English. So let's not overstate it, but I think in any language. I'm going to do just a little bit of exposition. I assume this is all familiar to all of you. And then I'm going to draw your attention to some sort of pathologies. Hume, all of our ideas are ultimately derived from impressions, right? Absolutely standard Hume. Therefore, we can have no idea of cause, nor can we have the concept of a body with external and continued existence. We can't have any of these ideas. The only idea of cause that we can have is an idea of constant conjunction of impressions in the past combined with a feeling of necessity in us. Okay? That's his substitute idea for cause. There is no way to rationally infer from a past regularity to a future regularity. Okay? Anything unusual about this just sort of restatement of some of the main parts of Hume's epistemology? But now what I'm going to do is, I actually, when I was a graduate student, I took a course on Hume, and I've also done other courses where Hume was partly studied. In none of them did anyone ever point out what I'm going to say now, and that's always puzzled me. Actually, one of the reasons I'm writing the book is I just get to actually say these things, So remember the 4, because now what we're going to do is we're going to see how they make no sense together or some of them individually. So the first intellectual pathology, I'm going to give an example of self-undermining, because this is the one I want to start with. If there is no rational way to infer future regularities from past regularities, then even if all ideas have been ultimately derived from impressions in the past, it cannot be rational to conclude that in the future, all ideas will be ultimately derivable from impressions. Does everybody see that? Did any of your teachers ever tell you this Hume's own conclusion that all ideas are ultimately derivable from impressions is itself irrational by his own epistemology? It's self-undermining. Nobody ever told me that. Never even just pointed it out to me. Okay. Now, how about self-refuting? If all ideas are ultimately derived from impressions, then we can have no idea of a past, excuse me, this is 3. I wanted to get to 2, self-refuting. In order to deny that we can have the idea of a cause or the idea of a body with external and continuing existence, Hume must use all of these ideas. So to deny that we can have these ideas, he has to use them. That's clearly self-refuting. And notice that he can't get out by substituting his conception of cause in his denial that we can have the idea of cause, because he clearly does not deny that we can have his conception of cause. It's the bad conception of cause that he denies that we can have. Anybody ever point that out to you? They didn't to me. Okay, then we get to a little more complicated one, but it's really fascinating. Another way that it's self-refuting. If all ideas are ultimately derived from impressions, then we can have no idea of a past conjunction of impressions because we can have no idea of the past. All impressions, even so-called impressions of memory, are current impressions. This implies immediately that it is not possible to have an impression of memory, because it is not possible to have an idea of a memory either. This should be obvious, because a memory is an impression caused by a past, a memory impression is an impression caused by a past impression. But for Hume, there is no way to have an idea of a cause. See, so in other words, already we've got caused by a past impression. In addition, as we see, have we seen here, for Hume, there is no way to have an idea of the past either. Of course, a so-called impression of memory could be an impression accompanied by a certain feeling. That's the way Hume distinguishes different impressions. But the feeling could not be a feeling of pastness, because there would be no way to have an idea of pastness. And now, just to pile on, for very much the same reasons, on Hume's account, we could have no idea of the future either. Anybody ever draw your attention to that? Hume's entire epistemology is self-refuting. The whole thing totally collapses. Okay, and then remember earlier I talked about explanation impairing framework substitutions? Now, of course, Hume is a phenomenalist, and we have all of the empiricists. Well, Locke's an interesting case, but anyway, certainly Berkeley was definitely, an idealist, a phenomenalist. And as a matter of fact, through the 18th and 19th centuries, I think I don't know, I haven't ever done a poll, but I think most epistemologists were phenomenalists, and a lot of the logical positivists were. Carnap's Aufbau was actually to show us how we can construct the world out of our impressions. And as you know, it failed, but that was the project. Okay, so anyway, because Hume denies that we can have the idea of a body with external and continued existence, Hume is a phenomenalist. Our ordinary framework of beliefs in ordinary physical objects with causal properties explains how our experiences change over time. For example, as we walk around a table, I'm right now sitting here at this desk, and I can easily imagine what it would be like if I just turned the desk so I was looking at the other side, because I've seen the other side of this desk many times. A phenomenalist framework cannot explain how our experiences change over time, because having a table impression without a table does not support any expectation about future experience. You can't walk around a table impression without a table. And so we have these substitute frameworks that actually take away explanatory value. But of course, for Hume, explanatory, the idea of explanation itself is some kind of idea of there being some kind of causal or other necessity. And so he would have said, I threw that one away. But now what we have to deal with is, look at everything else he threw away too. Okay. Why has such a pathological epistemology been so influential? Hume's epistemology was taken over with only minor modifications by the logical positivists, one of the most influential philosophical movements of the 20th century. And you see, I'm old enough to remember when logical positivism still exerted a big influence on philosophy. And basically, the expectation was that philosophy of language was just going to replace almost all of philosophy. There was really nothing else for philosophy to do except a few minor things, and then you could study language. The greatest influence on Wittgenstein, early and late, was Hume. One of the most influential movements in epistemology today, naturalized epistemology, takes Hume as its founder. Quine famously wrote, quote, "The Humean predicament is the human predicament." You know, that was in his essay, Naturalized Epistemology. And by that he meant, I mean, he was right clear about it. Where we were with rational belief with Hume, and remember, with Hume, we hadn't gotten very many rational beliefs. Well, we haven't gotten any further since then either. And then there's this really interesting survey by Berget and Chalmers. And if you want to, I can send you the reference to it. But anyway, it was English-speaking philosophers for the most part, identified Hume as basically the non-living philosopher with whom they most identify. And then on the issue of whether they had a Humean or non-Humean position on laws of nature, which is going back to that issue I was just talking about, whether there's causal necessity, 24.7% of all respondents and 45.9% of those who specialize in philosophy of science endorsed a Humean view, one according to which law of nature is a misnomer because they are simple reports of regularities with no causal or any other kind of necessity. So I just want you to see, Hume, everybody knows this, but Hume's epistemology is still very much alive in the 21st century. Now, Hume is only one example. And rather than me coming up with other examples, I thought I would ask you. Now, think back, these repressed memories. I just want you to bring back some of those repressed memories of epistemologists who ended up with absurd or insane results. And by the way, I've given you extreme examples in Hume, but just the result that we could have no rational beliefs about the future, that would be a form of insanity. If you really, really took that seriously, you couldn't make any plans for the future at all. So what about other epistemologists who end up in positions that really, in other words, I'm not just saying, well, I disagree with them. I'm saying that just by the ordinary standards of whether or not you would be regarded as a sane human being, they're insane. Please, the floor is open. Unmute yourself if you're muted. This is our group therapy. No one can think of anyone else?
Well, how about Graham Priest?
Graham Priest.
Yeah.
Okay, now Graham Priest, you're doing his theory of truth, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a
Yeah.
really interesting one. That's a really interesting one. It's not actually an epistemology, but it's one that sounds absurd on its face. I think we could have a really interesting conversation about that one, but I would like to, if I can, keep it okay. Like epistemologies, like right. I already mentioned Berkeley's idealism, right?
Okay.
I mean, here's the thing. Let's do phenomenalism because people get so used to it. They they don't even think about what it would be like to really believe in it. To really believe in it, I would have to think each of you is just a product of my own mental life. You are just impressions in my mind. That's all you are. And I mean, think about, again, it's sort of like sometimes philosophers get so used to this. To really believe that would make a tragic life, that you couldn't actually have any interactions with any other people except these little, I mean, remember, as soon as I close my eyes, you don't even exist anymore. And then I open my eyes, oh, you're back in my mind. What would be the point of life if I couldn't have any relationships with other people? Now, I know an epistemologist will always say, yeah, but Bill, for all you are, subject to the evil demon, and everyone is just a figment in your mind. But I'm not talking about that now. I'm talking about I'm not worried yet. I'm just saying, what would it be like to really believe it? To really believe it would mean my life was total tragedy. There's this being and it's controlling all of my sensations so that I have no human relations, no relation to anything else. There's nothing that I can actually do that would make a difference in the world. All I can do is just think.
Can we get it away from the Cartesian demon a little bit? Is there another way to think about this, of this kind of solipsism that you're describing?
Um,
I'm not sure. My
oh,
question is.
I'm just trying to, yeah, I'm just trying to, yeah, I mean, here's think about it from Kant's point of view. Kant says, well, his problem was he thought, remember, one of the assumptions of the proof paradigm was rational belief has to be infallible, and he couldn't explain how rational beliefs could be infallible if they were about things in themselves, his synthetic a priori. So he said, no, what happens is we impose certain things on our experience, right? And that's how we can know them infallibly, because we are the authors of them. And I say, and so then it says, what we can know is the world of our experience. We cannot know the world of things in themselves. And this is exactly what I'm talking about, how Western epistemology, they doing the best they can, but they can't get out. And you know that. I mean, just, all the people who've struggled to try to just be able to rationally believe in external world. But I say, no, it's actually really important part of my life and your life too, that we are able to interact with other people who are things in themselves. And of course, I don't have infallible knowledge about you or your thoughts or whatever. So what? Did that help, Andrew?
It does. It does. Right. Um, I'm wondering if we could drag Nozick's experience machine in here. And
Well, the experience machine, again, it's not an epistemological thought experiment. It's to actually find out what you care about. Okay? And the experience machine works even if you're already on the experience machine. That's a really interesting thing about it, because it's a question about what you care about. And so suppose unknown to me, I'm on an experience machine where I'm given the option of hooking up to an experience machine. I find out that I care about more than my experiences when I refuse to hook up. And then you say,
Right.
aha, Bill, but it's too bad because you're already, and then I say, if you're right, then my life is a tragic life, because then you now know, you just gave me a test. You know what I care about, and it's not just my experiences. And you're telling me nonetheless, I cannot actually affect anything except my experiences. And that, I mean, that's overwhelmingly sad and tragic. And so, well, I mean, uh, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I said the, uh, here's I mean, this is the kind of thing. I mean, just this is just to Wittgenstein. His whole argument of the investigations depends on his persuading you that the following series has no rational continuation. Here's the series: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How long do I have to continue it? 11, 12, 13. Let me stop at 14. There isn't any rationally unique in the continuation. Now, of course, if you just make the point, anybody who's doing the series, they could do it to fool you. They could do it for all sorts of other reasons. But the question is just this: is there a way of identifying the rational continuation? I mean, it's a no-brainer. But once he persuades you of that, then you realize there's nothing left that rationality can do. And that's his whole point. His whole point is that rationality is the part of philosophy that you can't get out of. It's the fly in the fly bottle. The only way you get out of it is you stop talking about it. As if rationality is an important distinction. Well, if you just think it's like continuing the series, what hinges on that? But now we get into the real world, and in the real world, we have all these, I mean, white supremacist ideologies. We have these fascist epistemologies. We have all these things where hugely important things depend on them. And what's Wittgenstein saying? Wittgenstein's saying there aren't any rational or irrational distinctions. There's just fitting in with your group. That is the key idea of what I'm calling fascist epistemology, which we see in many different countries now. The idea of fascist epistemology is you replace whatever rationality is with fitting in with the group. Does everybody realize we're living in a country where that is happening before our eyes? Where people decide what to believe, not on the basis of rational considerations, but on the basis of fitting in with their group. And you say, Wittgenstein, there's something important that your philosophy left out. We need some philosophy. We need something that actually can help us distinguish between rational and irrational belief. I mean, again, I'll just give you a few more, just so because it's so startling. It's so startling. The logical positivists, they're all these smart guys. The logical positivists, all these smart guys. This is the early Wittgenstein too, right? He was. And so what's their philosophy? Their summary of their philosophy, their epistemology. Here's the summary of their epistemology. All rational beliefs are either analytic or they're statements that have been verified by experience. That's just, and anybody who studies logical positivism, the question that you ask is, what's the status of that very statement? And according to the statement, it's either analytic or it's something verified by experience. And it seems clear to everybody it's neither one. That's the heart of their philosophy. How in the world are all these smart people, when they work all their, everything they can do, and they come up with something which is actually self-undermining.
I've heard, Bill, I've heard a logical positivist defend that proposition by saying that it's justified pragmatically, not rationally.
Yeah, you see, and this is what I want you to do is I want you to feel people struggling. I want you to see them struggling. And we would go on, if we went on, I'd say, what about pragmatism? I don't have time to talk about it now, but when they say justified pragmatically, that's a kind of relativism, remember earlier, and it's going to lead to other paradoxes. But thank you for drawing my attention to it, Paul, because these are smart people. They always have something they can say. But what I want to know is, why are they trapped? Why are they trapped that these are the only alternatives? Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just very briefly make a little move to point us in another direction. And then I'll stop and open the floor for discussion. Because what I want to say is once you've gone through all these things and you see the moves, you know, we could have talked about pragmatism and then you see the moves, then you realize they always end up just in more problems, more trouble. And what I'm suggesting is there's a reason for that. And the reason is that they've been infected by certain intellectual pathologies, which I call the 5 presuppositions of the proof paradigm. And once you've been infected with those, you're trapped. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through. Oh, actually, there was Quine's thesis in terms of translation. Only observation sentences have determinate meaning. That's what Quine actually says. This thesis is self-refuting. If we can understand it, it is false because it is not an observation sentence. Now, again, Paul, somebody will struggle to say, well, wait a minute, I'll explain why. But I'm just saying, look right at it. Okay, Wittgenstein's way out. The problem is the 5 presuppositions, the proof paradigm. So what I want to do is I want to go back to the epistemological Garden of Eden, and I want to point a pathway to another kind of epistemology, another pathway for epistemology. So here we go back, and of course we now know is epistemology starts when people discover they can make mistakes. And suppose that when people discovered that they had made a mistake, instead of reacting with shame and anxiety, they had responded with wonder and curiosity. What a remarkable ability we have to correct our own mistakes, fallibly, of course, right? We don't have there's no infallibility anywhere in the whole thing. How are we able to do it? In other words, they just say, that's really fascinating that we're able to do it. How are we able to do it? If they had asked that question, they would have built an epistemology not on proof, but they would have focused on mistake-correcting reasoning. And instead of focusing on inferential reasoning, which is monotonic, they would have focused on reasoning that can subtract beliefs as well as add beliefs. That is non-monotonic reasoning. So they wouldn't have been drawn to inferences at all. Inferences are necessarily monotonic. They would have been looking at some other kind of reasoning, non-monotonic reasoning. Okay. Actually, this is a slide I'm just going to skip over because it's something that, but I suppose philosophy had been asking about mistake-correcting reasoning. What I want to say is that what you could say to me, well, but actually, Bill, in Western philosophy, they address mistake-correcting reasoning. And I'm going to close by saying, yeah, but here's how they address it. First of all, defeater reasoning. And, you know, I think defeater, the framework is actually a useful kind of framework for classifying reasoning, but it can't explain it. And here's a simple example why, but the deeper examples are, it doesn't explain any of the changes. Even in this, everybody's here is familiar with the defeater, where you believe that P, and then you get the belief that Q, and Q defeats P. Okay, that's the simplest kind of defeater reasoning. Even in the simple case in which a belief that P is defeated by a belief that Q, there is no explanation of why Q defeated P rather than P defeating Q. Remember, you started off believing P. Why in the world did you ever then believe Q? Why didn't P defeat it? There is no explanation of this. Now, that's really the simplest case. And the deeper one is there's no explanation of it all. In other words, people do this whole structure, but there's no explanation of why at any stage one thing gets defeated by something else rather than vice versa. Or remember, you can have P and then you have a defeater Q for P. But maybe there's an R, which is a defeater for Q. And so then Q doesn't defeat P. But you have the same problem. Why does R defeat Q rather than Q defeating R? And the whole defeater analysis can't explain any of that. Okay. The most popular kind of explanation of mistake correcting reasoning is Bayesian epistemology. And Bayesian epistemology is a great advance because by having degrees of belief rather than beliefs, it can actually explain some mistake correcting reasoning. And in my book, I have an extensive discussion of Bayesian epistemology. But here, still, just right here, we can look at it, study it, and you'll find there's 6 kinds of mistake correcting reasoning that Bayesianism cannot explain. Changes in one's logic, changes in one's epistemology, changes in extreme credences, 0 or 1, to non-extreme credences, any credence other than 0, 1. Changes in credence due to the discovery of a new theory rather than new evidence, like the discovery of the Copernican hypothesis. Bayesianism can't explain why there would be a change in credences and theories just because of the discovery of a new theory. Changes in a priori, that ultimate prior credences, the credences that start the whole thing off. And then also the discovery that some of one's credences are irrational. And this is really important because when I want to get down to the real world, I want to say, but can't epistemology help us understand the difference between rational and irrational credences, beliefs? And here we can say, and can't it explain how it is that we could discover that we have irrational credences? Well, as you know, for the Bayesian theory, Bayesian agents are ideally rational. They never have irrational credences, so they could never discover that they have irrational credences. But that would be a kind of important kind of intellectual blindness if human beings couldn't discover they had irrational credences. Okay. And Mike says, sorry, he has to go. Okay. Thanks for joining us, Mike. Okay. So anyway, that's it. This is the last slide that I'm going to use, but it just jumped away. So let me get it for you. The alternative that I'm going to actually articulate and defend in my book is that rationality is what makes someone a good learner. It's not primarily a logical ability, it has nothing to do with proving theorems. It involves, except that, interestingly enough, proving theorems involves this kind of rationality too, and I give some examples in my book. It involves sensitivity to clues, imagination to envision new or surprising explanations of the clues, and the ability to evaluate alternative explanations by how good or bad they are as explanations. One important indication of how good a learner someone is comes from how able they are to correct their own mistakes. And in the book, I go on to develop an alternative to, remember my 3 alternatives were Platonism, relativism, and skepticism, an alternative way of understanding rationality that doesn't, that avoids the problems with all 3 of those. But my goal here today was to just draw to your attention how much of Western epistemology is totally irrelevant to important real world questions, and why it seems to be so limited that for the people who advocate these different epistemologies, it's almost impossible for them to avoid saying something that's self-refuting or self-undermining. Right? I mean, think of all the ones who get rid of truth, and so they say there is no truth. And what you want to ask them is what you just said true? And if they're pragmatists and they say, well, what's true is what works. And then I say, all I want to say is, in order to be true by your criterion, does it really have to work? Does it have to be true that it works? Okay, thank you very much. And now I'm happy to open the floor to discussion and questions.
Thank you, Bill.
Mm.
Well, I'll have a question if to start, I guess, if no one else does.
Okay.
Why can't I say regarding an impression of the past that I'm directly aware that my impression has an intentional object, and that intentional object is last summer. So I'm thinking about my memory of last summer, and it seems to me I'm directly aware of its intentionality, and that intentionality is directed at an object that is last summer.
If
Why
you,
can't I
if you
say
say
that
that
in
to me,
response?
I mean, that what you said sounds perfectly sensible to me, okay? Sounds perfectly sensible, right? But I'm just saying, you know what Hume is going to ask? Where did you get the idea of intentional object?
Hmm.
I mean, just think about it. He's going to say, you definitely can have a current impression of something. And if you want to call it an intentional object, he says, I'm fine with that. But then you just also added to it, the intentional object is something in the past. And I'm just asking, where did it get that content?
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. You see, this is the thing where it's so easy to think, oh, but wait a minute. There are ways out of this problem. And there are, if you just use common sense. But if you do it, with, like under the constraints that Hume himself is operating on, I mean, because I would just say, Hume, if you say I can have an impression of an intentional object in the past, where I don't, well, I better stop right here because I don't want to actually get going on intentional objects.
Okay.
What I want you to see is it's very, very, very limited collection of ideas that Hume thinks we can get from impressions. I see Russ has his hand up.
Yeah, so I guess I'm curious why Popper doesn't show up among the mistake correcting epistemologies, or for that matter, Socrates. And I think I have a kind of broader consideration behind that. And that is that at the level of arguments are going to be monotonic, right? Arguments have premises, they lead to conclusions, so you're always adding something. But inferences and arguments happen within a broader process of rationality. And in that broader process, you might be making adjustments, accepting, rejecting. It isn't necessarily adding on.
Oh, I'm with you. In other words, now you're saying, let's talk about rationality as a broader thing, okay? All I want to draw your attention to is that what you just described, I want to go back and talk about Socrates. And the thing about Socrates is, as we all know, in most of the dialogues, particularly the ones that I think are really Socratic dialogues, Socrates starts off thinking there's some important idea, and in order to be able to talk about it at all, we have to have a definition of it. And I think what you have is a really exemplary example of rational inquiry. And the conclusion that I think Socrates should have drawn was, notice, I started off thinking we had to have a definition of this idea in order to be able to even talk about it. And yet we've done this whole dialogue of rational inquiry into, friendship, you name it, whatever it is, knowledge, even though at the end we don't have an adequate definition. Is that the conclusion that Socrates drew? No, the conclusion, for him, it's always despair. In order for us to even be able to talk about it, we have to have the definition. And at the end, we find out we don't have a definition. And that's why I say he's, a skeptic, and he's trapped. And I liked even the way that you put it, because you said arguments are monotonic. I think that's a mistake, But I think Socrates was trapped by that, because what we should see is, and this is something all students of philosophy should learn, certainly in their epistemology class. Anytime anybody gives you an argument to the conclusion, and a conclusion is insane, or just, even if you actually believe all the premises, okay, you believe all the premises, and the premises logically imply the conclusion, rationality does not require you to accept the conclusion, right? Isn't that right? And that's a way of seeing even arguments are not monotonic in the, it's just philosophy always reconstructs them as monotonic because they have these damned rules of inference, but they aren't. We're always trying to make the most sense. And that means if we get to a really crazy conclusion and the argument is valid, we better go back and find out which one of the premises is a problem. And that to me that's my whole approach to Western epistemology. If they keep coming up with these conclusions that are sometimes literally insane, sometimes self-refuting, sometimes self-undermining, what are the presuppositions that are driving them to these conclusions? So I agree with you 100%. That's a model of rationality I can embrace as soon as we say even arguments are not monotonic. But do you see how Socrates couldn't do it? He couldn't do it. He was so trapped by this picture. All he needed was a definition, and then he could start reasoning from it. And so he missed what was actually going on in the dialogue, which was this fascinating display of rationality. And by the way, a display of showing that they did understand what they were talking about, even though they had no definition of it. Yeah.
So what comes to mind at this moment is that Socrates maybe had the wrong target in mind. He thought he was going for knowledge, but what he actually got was understanding.
Ah,
And that's
I love that idea
the
too.
curiosity for me, is that these are not really the same thing.
Man, you could have written my book, Russ, because that's what I propose. We replace knowledge with understanding. And understanding doesn't require truth, actually. You can get a lot of understanding as long as something is true enough. And so that's a technical term. Catherine Elgin uses it, and I think it's great. And so it means, and it just changes so much, because then you can say, well, look, we now know, like Newtonian mechanics is not literally true, but it's certainly true enough to enhance our understanding of a lot of stuff, right? And philosophy too. Philosophy, I think, any self-aware philosopher should always be able to write a preface to whatever they write and say, there are lots of mistakes in this. We know there are lots of mistakes. My goal is not to, only write things that are true. I'm going to do the best I can. But my goal is to help promote understanding by saying things that are true enough. Boy, that would reorient philosophy. Okay, and then what about Popper? I have to say something about Popper, because these are tragic figures. Socrates is a tragic figure in philosophy because he represents a model of rational inquiry and he himself can't recognize it. Popper, another very influential guy, and remember at the talk yesterday, when you and Mark gave your presentation, there was a talk about, oh yeah, well, but at least, we have the Popperian idea of falsification rather than verification, and I say, yeah, these are really important ideas. But what about Popper? Popper called his method the method of critical rationalism. And what did he say when he addresses, I can give you the passage if you want it. He says, what can I say in defense of critical rationalism itself, the whole method? He says, since I'm not going to be dogmatic, the only thing I can say is, for me, it's a matter of irrational faith. His whole philosophy is a matter of irrational faith. This is tragic. But do you see if suppose somebody, has the craziest view, they're a creationist or something like that, and you say to them, yeah, well, but is your creationism falsifiable? And they say, oh, you must be a Popperian. But don't you know Popper himself says his whole method is based on irrational faith. I base mine on what I think is rational faith, so I'm better than Popper. And you smile and you cry. You have to cry.
I have a question.
Yeah,
I'm
Steve,
trying.
it's good.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It's definitely thought provoking. As I was listening to you, one of the things that I would like to try to get a little sharper is your difference from the pragmatists. And the reason I say it is this, because you start out your narrative with a lot of what I think Dewey would agree with, right? That Western philosophy is motivated by this anxiety, this quest for certainty, as Dewey puts it, and so it adopts this kind of rationality, which is truth directed, right? And it both has this feature that it's really emphasizes mathematical proof, and it has this conception of truth as, hey, we're trying to get the beliefs that match the world, so we're trying to figure out what does it really mean to give evidence? What does it really mean to justify? And to answer that question in a way that gives us correspondence to the world. And of course, the Deweyan emphasis is a kind of mistake correcting rationality, right? He wants to adopt these general norms of science that you see embedded and expand them to ethics, expand them to other areas of culture. And so as I was listening to you, I was noticing a lot of overlap with the pragmatists that they seem to scorn, right? So I kind of want the explanation of that. But the second thing I think this really gets to the heart of my question about your approach. You, in place of a proof paradigm, suggest that we have a notion of rationality that's mistake correcting. But operating in the background here is some notion of truth.
Oh yeah.
Right? That a mistake, right? And so, but on one hand, you start out saying there's these three paradigms: there's Platonism, there's skepticism, there's relativism. And then, so what's the conception of truth? You hinted at that in your book that you come up with a fourth, right? So what's the conception of truth that's operating here? You gave me true enough a minute ago, but I think for most of us, true enough is a little.
But okay, well, but anyway, thank you for this question.
For sure.
Because just like Popper, see, Popper, one of my favorite epistemologists, Dewey, one of my favorite epistemologists. And now you're going to hear, of course, remember I just said Popper, it turns out it's like a tragic story. Okay, well, get ready. Because Dewey, again, he looks out and he diagnoses this problem with Western epistemology. It's very similar to the diagnosis that I'm giving. And so what does he say? And this only way that you could think this is if you're trapped. The problem is we have to replace truth with something else. And once we do that, all of our problems go away. And then, but I'm just saying, before I get to, and he then gives a theory of learning in terms of problem situations. It's a beautiful theory of learning, absolutely a beautiful theory of learning. And it's really, so in other words, when we're at the level of looking at what his proposal is, I'm saying, go for it. But then he steps back and he gets philosophical. And when he gets philosophical, he says, yeah, for example, but how in the world can we take this approach and then have a role for truth in it? And when he asks that question, he has to already be subject to certain presuppositions about what it is, because when you approach it from my direction, truth isn't some unapproachable absolute. Truth is, we're committed to truth just in thinking that we make a mistake. You see, that's the idea of a mistake includes an idea of truth. And by the way, for the big fancy kinds of beliefs like, scientific theory, I think often there, true enough is quite good enough. But even that essentially involves truth. It's not something that substitutes for truth. But for a lot of other things, truth is absolutely crucial. And for a pragmatist, every time you always ask for the pragmatist, what are you going to substitute for truth? Okay.
Yeah,
And it's some kind of standard of, satisfying something, and you just ask them, do you care whether, suppose it's like making you happy? I don't care what it is. But for Dewey, it's really interesting because once you do understanding, it's not just like being happy or something like that. It's actually an epistemic goal. And understanding, is going to require some connection to truth. But right now, all I want to say is this. For all of the pragmatists, whatever the goal is that they identify is something they really care about. And so I say, so in order to be true in your sense, does it really have to satisfy that goal? In other words, does it have to be true that it satisfies that goal? Or does it have to just satisfy, believing that it satisfies the goal? In other words, you see that all of them are somehow so scared by the idea of truth that they think there's just some easy way out. But all of them ultimately have to care about the truth of something. Otherwise, the whole thing is trivial.
Why, if I could just ask one follow-up.
Yeah.
So what's the problem with this response? You could imagine somebody responding to you like this. Look, it's all good and well that we be concerned with truth, but in order for truth to be action guiding, we need to be able to say something about it. We need to be able to have a theory of it, under the assumption that in order to hit it, you need to have an idea of your target, right? You need some clear sense of what you're aiming for. Otherwise, you're unlikely to hit it. And if you do hit it, you're not going to be able to tell when you get there. But the problem is we can't say a whole lot about what truth is. You can say it's a relation of correspondence between intellect and object. You can say it's a relation between you can say that it's a relation between our sentences in the world. You could say it's the additional thing beyond justification, but it's empty. And I take it to be the pragmatist point that, look, what we should be talking about instead of truth is justification, because we can tell when a belief has a bunch of evidence in its favor. We can't tell if it matches the true nature of the world, but we can tell if it's justified. We can tell if there's a bunch of proof for it, if there's a demonstration for it, if there's reasons to believe it, and you can take that in the broadest sense of the term you want. And so what about this proposal that just says, yeah, of course there's a world out there, right? The problem is getting yourself in a position where you can tell when your norms of rationality, your norms of justification produce utterances that actually match the world. And this proposal would have just been, yeah, let's just talk about justification. This doesn't mean just matching whatever your beliefs are to your culture, but it wouldn't mean, it's kind of deflationism about truth, right? It wouldn't mean aiming for truth as a goal.
Thank you for that excellent statement of what it's like to be able to be trapped by certain presuppositions that make it look like the solution is to get rid of truth. Notice you said, well, we have to be able to say something about it. We have to be able to, but really what I'm going to try to do is something else, which is to say, if you could get rid of all those presuppositions, that in order to be able to aim at truth, we'd have to have, because whatever you substituted, we're going to have the same problem. You see, suppose you say it's proof or something like that. And I can say, well, but maybe we're just all really terrible at proofs. And so we're always taken in by proofs. And actually, and you see, it's the same structure. You see the structure, and it's always the same. But let me say, I have to go beyond it now, because these always sound like skeptical arguments, but they're not. What they're meant is to say, instead of thinking that at the outset, like Socrates, we have to have a definition or something like this, let's be open to exploration. Let's just be open to exploration, and we can start the exploration by saying, well, what's the difference between rational and irrational belief? I'm fine with that. What happens when we start the exploration with an open mind is that we find out that that exploration itself depends on our being able, and again, fallibly to be able to access some kind of truth. Access is a funny word because I don't have any direct access to them. But the truths are not truths about like the form, but they're like this. Suppose you say, I mean, I just did it for proof, or suppose you say, well, look at the evidence for evolutionary theory, and you be the one who believes in evolutionary theory, I'll be the creationist. And you say, notice all this evidence that supports evolutionary theory, and I'm the creationist, and I say, no, it doesn't. It supports my creationism. And there, what we're disagreeing about is what's true about what that evidence supports. And at some point, when you reach the bottom, you're going to find, well, you know, that, and someone like Popper, because of his model of what rationality requires, says, I just have to sort of take it on irrational faith that the evidence that we have, of course, he wouldn't say it supports anything, but I'll, you know, do a version of it, supports evolutionary theory rather than creationism. And a pragmatist might say, well, yeah, you know, well, but if you believe in evolutionary theory, somehow that's going to have better consequences or something like that. But each time, whatever they say, I always want to say is, are you saying that it'll really have better consequences? At some point, just all we're doing is doing the exploration, and we find ourselves confronted with, oh yeah, I'm committed to certain things being true. But then we don't throw it out or anything like that and say, because we don't have any highfalutin ideas about what truth is, it's just whatever makes it the case that the evidence that we have supports evolutionary theory and doesn't support creationism, even though creationism has been designed to be compatible with all that evidence. And it's a really interesting question why it supports one rather than the other. And let's explore it. But what we see is that as we're doing the exploration, we keep coming back to, yeah, okay, to do the exploration, to make sense of what we're doing, we are committed to certain things being true. And as opposed to thinking we prove them or we get them on irrational faith, ultimately, the story is one of fitting together all these different relevant considerations in this kind of, you know, story that I'm trying to tell. And there isn't any way to get outside. So some people want to say, well, you know, Talbot, that sounds like a coherence theory. It's not, but any kind of adequate theory will sound somewhat like a coherence theory because the reasons are going, the supporting reasons are going in all directions. They're not unidirectional as in inferences. And the reasoning goes through lots of other beliefs. But then you can say, oh, so, you know, with the coherence theory, how do you ever get outside to tell what's true? Here's absolutely key insight that everyone who studies philosophy should get in their first philosophy course. There's some false presupposition in that question. How do you step outside, right? It goes back to Berkeley. You know, you said you can't step outside. There's a false presupposition. What would it be to step outside? Is it like something that other people can do, but you just can't do it? No, because to step outside means you leave behind all of your cognitive faculties. So when you step outside, how do you cognize anything? The only answer must be you use some other cognitive faculties, okay? And the same problem arises for that. But the idea that somehow to believe in truth requires you to think that you could step outside to check or something like that, that's a false presupposition about truth. It doesn't require it at all. As a matter of fact, instead, if you just do inquiry and find where it leads you, you find out, oh yeah, now I mean, look, here's the kind of thing that, again, I always want to bring it back to, because to me, it's really very powerful. And it's, for whatever the pragmatists say about what they replace truth with, that means suppose they replace it with, you know, just what works for me or something like that. I just have to use a simple one. That means all of a sudden, all of you lose your reality, and you only get your reality back to the extent that it works for me to believe in you. But that isn't reality. That's just like phenomenalism. That means you're just a kind of a construction of my mental state. But look, if I say it's true that you exist, I may be mistaken, but that's an extremely important fact that colors all of life. Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, when they were undergraduates, they were philosophy students, and it was just part of the air that you're phenomenalists. They were both phenomenalists. And Russell in his autobiography describes, one day we decided, let's just pretend that the world really existed, just the kind of world that we think it is. And they were delighted. All these things which had seemed sort of two-dimensional, all of a sudden seemed robust. And all I wanted to say is that, but even they couldn't imagine the biggest difference, which was before, for Russell, Moore was just this two-dimensional blob. And for Moore, Russell was just this, and all of a sudden they were really friends and they were sharing this. And all I'm saying is that that's part, when we engage in this kind of inquiry, then we find out, oh, truth plays an important role, but it's not the kind of role that philosophers thought, where, yeah, we had to be able to first figure out how we get to it and how we get outside our cognitive equipment to check. Does that help?
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Looks like Monica has a question.
Yeah, I see Monica has a question. Monica.
Thanks. So I'm trying to see if I have the conception of truth that you're talking about here, Bill, which is, so for me, it helps to step inside.
Mm-hmm.
So my students sometimes ask me, well, is someone's opinion true? And I say, well, absolutely. If my opinion is that I, Monica Offrecht, like chocolate ice cream, that is true.
Okay.
And to me, that connects with, the Cartesian, there's a thinking thing. Is that the kind of truth you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about, Monica, do you exist, or are you just a figment of my imagination? You see, I don't see how you could be wrong about whether you like chocolate ice cream, but I could definitely be wrong that you don't, that thinking you exist. But
So it needs to be fallible.
I'm saying just fallible, but you exist. I'm not worried about your existence. It's just, what I'm worried about is all these philosophies that say there's no, so what? On my philosophy, you give up Monica's existence, but you still have this two-dimensional blob that behaves exactly the way she does in your mind. And I say, that's a huge loss. That's a huge loss. Do you think I would spend, Monica, people as students with me, do you think I would spend all the time that I do writing comments on papers if I thought my students were just two-dimensional blobs in my mind?
Sure, but the pragmatists don't say that.
What?
I said, sure, but the pragmatists don't say that.
No, the pragmatists, but I'm saying, why don't they say that? Because now they say, oh, but it really matters. And to the course of your experience, it really matters whether or not you write those comments or not. And I say, really? It matters to the course of my experience? No, or here's a simpler example. I read about it definitely happened, tsunami, in the South Pacific. I send money, aid to the victims of the tsunami. If I thought they were just two-dimensional blobs in my imagination, would I have sent money to the, and people will come up with some crazy theory about my psychology, but I'm telling you, no, I would not have done it.
There's two different issues here. There's two different issues here. There's one is the conception of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is, how should we act towards the external world? If it's the case, which you're denying, that we can't be certain that there is an external world, to that, couldn't it be a kind of Pascal's wager?
Do you think I'm saying that we can be certain? I'm not saying that certainty has nothing to do with it. I'm thinking if you're thinking about it in terms of certainty, you're still trapped by one of these, at least one of these presuppositions. Certainty has nothing to do with it. All I'm saying is, is it rational for me to believe that you exist? And it's a long, it's a long answer to why it is. But I just think without to do the inquiry, we would be saying, yeah, this would be a classic example of the kind of belief that we would be interested to know, yeah, why is it rational to believe that other people exist? All I'm saying is if you convince me that it's not rational, that's be a life-changing event for me, because then there are all these things that make no sense for why I'm doing them, you know?
I could imagine a solipsist saying to you, of course, I realize there's a problem there, but I could imagine, yeah, but I could imagine a solipsist saying to himself, well, I'm just playing a video game with myself. I'm playing with myself. It's my mind is this little video game. I don't know where it came from, but I'm having fun all by myself, talking to Bill Talbot and playing other games on my little machine in my mind.
Yeah. And I say, you know, it would be really sad if that were the only aspiration you had for your life. Now you're a solipsist and that's the only aspiration you have for your life. And to me, I just say it's really sad. I say, let's consider another alternative. Just be open to it. In other words, I'm not saying, let's be open to the possibility that you've misunderstood rationality. And so your misunderstanding has trapped you in that world of video games.
I think let me venture this thesis then to see if I can get this difference between you and the pragmatist sharp. See if you agree with this. So for me, the pragmatists, they, like you, think we should get rid of this quest for certainty. They think we should really focus on mistake correcting rationality, right? But your idea is their change to the conception of truth just is insane, right? It just throws them off of the proper path. And what they would emphasize is, well, look, what we can really talk about is justification. You can't really say anything about truth. So let's just talk about whether our beliefs are justified. And maybe you would too. Maybe you would agree with that too. But you're saying their talk of justification necessarily presupposes some thicker, intuitive conception of truth, which they don't want to have.
Yeah.
And further, here I think is the real point. Their idea of what's rational, and here maybe this is why you hate Wittgenstein, their idea of what's rational, when it hits bedrock, doesn't get grounded in the world out there. What it gets grounded in is a sociological fact about the inquirers who are inquiring. So they're going to say, yeah, of course, there's going to be norms of rationality, but at the end of the day, there's nothing that you can get those norms of. There's no question of what would ultimately ground those norms of rationality other than some cultural facts about the community of inquirers that we're dealing with. And you want to deny that claim. You want to say rationality ultimately gets grounded not in a sociological fact, but in some fact about the world.
That's a really nice way of putting it. And because you did it so briefly, there are potential ways of misunderstanding it. But what I want to do is I want to say, but there's also a potential way of understanding it as being correct. And here's a quick, every time you say, because if it gets grounded arbitrarily in some sociological facts, then it's a kind of relativism, right? And what you have is you say, well, we have our conception of rationality, and whatever it is, you ground it, and you tell me what you grounded it in, and then I'll tell you, oh, and look, here's this other community, and theirs is grounded, and you're telling me that neither one of them is better than the other. They're both just grounded in certain kinds of sociological facts.
Well, I think the pragmatist would respond like this. It's not that I'm saying truth is relative. I'm saying there's not a whole lot to say about truth, that what we should talk about is justification.
Yeah, rationality. I just translated rationality. Rationality is absolutely key. If rationality, that's why I said earlier, they're relatives about truth and relatives about rationality. And both of them are really equally nihilistic, because ultimately then what you say is there could be this other culture or whatever. And in this other culture, I mean, again, I do my kinds of examples. In our culture, and by the way, I'm not sure which culture we live in, to tell you the truth, but in our culture, the evidence that we have is evidence for evolution. In this other culture, it's a religious culture, the evidence, that's the very same evidence, is evidence for creationism. And what's interesting about rationality is that if you understand rationality, those can't both be true, because that evidence relation isn't something that you can just arbitrarily fix.
But I would agree. The problem is, though, when you have these two different norms of rationality, what to appeal to?
Ah, yes, what to appeal to. And so you want to get outside. But I think that what's really fascinating to me is that what I would recommend instead is, let's do some exploration. Let's do some exploration. Let's try to understand better what's involved, in making judgments about rationality and so on, and see where that leads. As opposed to some place, you want to stand outside and say, here I have a firm place to stand, and from here I can adjudicate the disputes. But you can't ever get outside. On the other hand, then, some people say, yeah, it is all arbitrary. And I'm just thinking, again, for right now, because we don't have time to do all the exploration. Well, let's not just assume that it is from the beginning. Let's actually do the exploration and see where it leads.
But the pragmatist agrees with you that getting outside isn't the right thing. That's why they say stop talking about truth, talk about justification.
That's why I'm right with them for so much, I'm right with them until they just then say, oh, throw the baby out with the bathwater, and yeah.
I appreciate that. I think that's a clear.
Yes, thanks. That's helpful.
Okay.
The thing that struck me when you keep referring to what it would be like for phenomenologists to take their view really seriously is that on any of these views where the other is just the figment of my own imagination or my own mind, I have no reason to care, okay? No reason to send money, for example.
Yeah.
And so it seems as though there's a kind of an ethical commitment to taking things as true. That the phenomenological approach misses. I'm not sure I'm putting this very well.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say is you can say there are all sorts of things, including our ethical beliefs, that actually, when we explore them, we find we are committed to their things being true. And it's not that we're committed to being infallible about anything, but it's really important. And if somebody throws that out, they lose something really important. Yeah, that's exactly right. I agree with you 100%. But it's not just ethical. In other words, if it were just ethical, then you would be sort of understating, because you find every area, you find places where it actually makes a difference in my self-understanding, my understanding of my life and so on, of whether or not certain things are true. And then somebody says to me, yeah, but Bill, you realize you're not infallible. You could be mistaken. You could be, hooked up to an experience machine. And I say, yeah, I know. And if that's true, it's tragedy. It's absolute tragedy, because then my life has much, much less significance than I was hoping it would have. And what blows me away is that, well, people who say, well, then it's just, you just live your life like it's a video game. And I think that would be like, I might play a video game for like an hour or two. And then after that, it would be total despair if I really believed it.
Bill, I have a question.
Yeah.
You seem to be using the concept of tragedy as if it has some kind of cognitive aspect to it. Am I interpreting you right? You're using it as some kind of pointer to truth.
Well,
The fact that
I-
something would lead to tragedy is evidence against it.
well, it's just to, I mean, you could use, I actually do have it with a cognitive aspect. That's right. Yeah. You know, I mean, but, uh, but however people use tragedy, that you should be able to recognize, oh, this would really be tragic. So in other words, I don't want to actually go into my cognitive theory of tragedy because I don't think it depends on it, but you're exactly right. Oh yeah, for me, I mean, in other words, for me, it's really true that Socrates is a tragic figure in philosophy because he represents something that he himself can't understand. He represents a kind of rational inquiry and he can't recognize that it's rational. That's
Now,
so
it seems to me that there's something behind this. If tragedy has a cognitive aspect to it, that it points us away from, well, that it tells us something about reality. It seems to me that behind that is a presupposition that the world isn't tragic in some sense, some presupposition about the nature of reality, that it's non-tragic.
Why does it have to be a presupposition? Maybe it's just it because we're saying so far. I mean, there's a lot that's tragic, but so far the whole thing isn't utterly tragic. That's just it's not a presupposition. It's just like I'm saying so far I'm still alive. You know, I could have died before now. So far I'm still alive. It wasn't a presupposition of anything that I'd be alive now, but as long as I can keep going and still avoid tragedy, I'll keep trying.
I agree with that, but antinatalists would jump right now on this claim that there's something non-tragic about life.
Oh, well, okay. I mean, people can disagree.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Well, maybe I've worn everybody out now. What do you think?
Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
Okay. I noticed you don't talk about inference to the best explanation.
Oh, I meant inference, the best explanation. I meant to mention it. Inference. It's even called inference. There are no inferences. So when you say inference, the best explanation, I'm saying to you, oh, come on. If that's your explanation of science, you've got to allow for what happens in science all the time, which is they throw out some of the evidence. Inference would be you start from the evidence and you go to the best explanation. But if anybody who's ever done scientific experiments, particularly when you're like calibrating your equipment, sometimes you get these really anomalous results. And the best explanation of the results would be the world is chaotic. But that what you should do is throw out some of the data because your measuring instruments weren't well calibrated. So if you say explanatory reasoning understood in this holistic way, which I think of as equilibrium reasoning, I'm right with you. But if you say inference is the best explanation, you're just showing the influence of this paradigm again. It's no inference. You know, and then the bigger thing is there are no inferences. And that's part of that comes from my earlier discussion with Russ, where once you realize that no matter what kind of reasoning somebody gives you, it's always open whether the rational thing to do is to accept the conclusion or give up one of the premises or something like that. There are no inferences. It's always that kind of thinking, which to me is holistic thinking, you know, and it's what makes the most sense.
Thank you.
Background is.
Thank you. Folks, are we in? Is this ending?
Yeah, thank you very much. And the questions were excellent. And they really gave me great opportunities to help, you know, sort of explain more my view. And they showed that you are really thinking. And I love it when we have a discussion where I can get people thinking. That's actually my goal in life.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
And you can see why my life would be a total tragedy if there weren't any other people. That's one of my main goals in life, is to get other people thinking. And then somebody persuades me, you're all just figments of my imagination and you can't even think. Oh, no wonder I'd be suicidal. Okay.
I look forward to the book.
What?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, well,
What was the title again?
it's called Learning from Our Mistakes. So you see, now you'll never, learning from our mistakes, you'll never forget that. And then it's Epistemology for the Real World. And I didn't really talk too much about the epistemology for the real world, except to show you how irrelevant to the real world a lot of epistemology is, Western epistemology. But, you know, I will talk in that book about all sorts of, you know, like racist and sexist beliefs, things like that, irrational beliefs that Western epistemology, until relatively recently, has had nothing to say about at all. You know?
Well, thank you, Bill. And I know everyone else agrees with me. We really appreciate your taking the time to present to us. And we really do. Anyone else want to chime in before we end this session?
I thank you
Thank you so much. Yeah.
so
Okay.
much.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, Bill. And I hope we see you again.
Oh, yeah, sure. Who knows? Yeah, I mean,
Well, maybe at the Northwest Philosophy Conference next year.
yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean,
Yeah.
life is going to get back to normal, I think. So again, you see, I am sort of an optimist, you know, so these people who think life is overwhelmingly tragic, they probably just, you know, say, yeah, you know, Talbot, he's incurable. Okay. Good
All
to
right.
see you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
And
Take care.
everyone take care. And I'm going to send an email later, just a debriefing.